Hello, welcome back to the world of career counseling. Today's topic has to do with the transitions that may occur in the course of one's career. And this includes both a section on a kind of general theoretical model of crisis and transition in career, and a section on some rather specific but relatively common problems that people do encounter in the course of their adult career development. The two sections, of course, may be viewed separately. So without further ado, we are going to jump in here to slideshow land. And that makes me don't have to look at my giant face anymore. I'm off to the corner. So sure, career crises and transitions, things that go bump in one's working life, so to speak. Now, in more general theoretical terms, by far the most influential model here is one developed by Hopson and Adams as far back as the 1970s. And this model posits that there is a series of about 7 stages through which one goes. Always remember, anytime you see a stage theory that says things proceed in the following steps, it is at best an approximation of the average or typical experience of an individual. You need not assume that every single client you work with is going to go through every single one of these stages. Some of them, especially some of the latter ones, in my opinion, are a little bit ill-defined. And bleed into one another a bit. But again, there could be a skipping over, there could be a backtracking to an earlier stage before moving forward. The theoretical model is there as a guide to your thinking to help you to make sense of all of the material that your client is producing to you. Because this is a situation or a set of situations in which career counseling overlaps more than ever with general purpose or personal counseling. Because, of course, it is very difficult for us emotionally to cope with major changes anywhere in our lives. So, again, the Hopson and Adams model is a stage model. And according to the theory, the very first thing that happens when you get the news of the big change is that you sort of freeze up. This is termed immobilization. It's like you don't know what to do with it. You can't process it yet. It's just, wow, this is happening. Incidentally, or not so incidentally, remember that when we speak of life-changing events, generally, we are speaking of one way of understanding what is also referred to as stressors. So if you go way back to the late 60s, the work of Holmes and Rahe, you may recall there's this idea of life change events as stressors, and that this includes not only negative life change events, but also positive ones. It is definitely stressful to separate from a long-term partner. It is also stressful to move in together with a beloved long-term partner. It is terribly stressful to lose a member of your family to death. It's also stressful to have a brand new wanted baby. And in the career world, what this suggests is that, yeah, of course it's stressful for you to, say, lose your job or have your company fold under you, but it can also be stressful to be promoted or get a plum assignment. Sure, typically the negative stressors are more stressful, relatively speaking, than the positive ones, but don't ignore the fact that positive events are also potentially stressful. You're the assistant manager of a store, and the district supervisor, whatever they're called, says to you, I've noticed you, young lady, you're very good at this. I'd like you to take charge as the manager of the new store we're opening in a city 100 miles away. And this will come with a 75% increase in your base salary, and we're really expecting great things of you in the future. Okay, that's not bad, but it does open up a whole new set of challenges in life. So as you just begin to process that, wow, something seems to be happening here, there will be an acute reaction. Now, if it's the positive event of, wow, I just got a big promotion and a big raise, it's likely to be elation. Whee, I feel great. In the unfortunately more frequent in our counseling work case of someone getting bad news, it's more of a despairing reaction. By the way, the chart over to the right, where the lettering is a little vaguer than I would like, is trying to illustrate your overall level of self-esteem or your overall mood state over time, right? So, immediately you're starting at a baseline, but then you're going, way up, wee, or way down, boo, in response to the news. And then further steps will occur, accordingly. So, the next thing that happens after the oh no or the yippee is that you kind of get to work. Well, the term is minimizing. It's hard to come up with a better word for it. You get to work mentally, kind of telling yourself it's not that big a deal. Everything's going to be normal. We'll get through just fine. I'm not going to have that much trouble being the manager in charge of a store with a dozen employees that I'm sorting out. I've been the assistant manager. It's not going to be hard to find a new job. I'll just have to go out there and get my name out there, and I'll have the new position in no time. Again, minimizing to a large extent. This is really just a matter of what sometimes is called emotion-focused coping. You're managing your internal state, bringing yourself back to a baseline. It's a kind of emotional homeostatic mechanism. Get myself back to my comfort zone emotionally and esteem-wise. But notice it's not actually doing anything problem-focused. We're not doing anything about the situation out there. That comes next, except that we wonder. There's this period of self-doubt when, again, notice the little mood curve is going down now. Can I do it? Can I actually manage my new responsibilities? I've been given my first command as a naval officer. Can I keep the ship afloat and the crew, at their stations? Can I find a new position having lost the one I've held for the last 8 years? That sort of thing. And when is nagged and worried and just kind of ruminating over this sort of thing. Again, notice not a directly effective way of managing the situation, but in a sense, you could think of it as to be sort of a wake-up call from your minimization efforts, this isn't such a little deal after all. The next phase, and by the way, it's from about here on that, in my opinion, for what that's worth, the model gets a little vague about, switches from one to the next. But the next thing involves letting go. That's what it's called. You're accepting the fact that this change is happening. I'm not going to work for Consolidated Widgets anymore. I'm not going to be in the service anymore. I've reached mandatory retirement age for my grade, my rank, and you start to say, all right, that old identity, to the extent that what I was doing before was part of my identity, that old identity is something that is now in the past tense, and I need not to be clinging to it and pretending that nothing at all is going to change. And as you begin to let go, you begin to feel a bit more confident, a bit more energized. The paralysis of the self-doubting and the ruminating, starts to dissipate. And then you have to get yourself out there. So, testing out is the next term. Here, if it's someone, say, who has lost a job of longstanding, perhaps unexpectedly, they're really getting much more active. At this point, they're actively networking. They're searching all the different possible sources of job listings. They're making sure they have their resume in good order and maybe several different versions of it for the different kinds of positions they might apply for. And they're in there doing it, getting all dressed up each day and hitting the pavement in old-fashioned terms, or more likely, hitting the keyboard and so forth. Now, at some point along the line, you're likely to succeed more or less. And in this time frame, then your mood should be considerably restored. Your self-esteem should be restored. But you're now trying to make sense of it, trying to put the event into the narrative of your life. This is part of who I am, that I was that, I lost that, or I was transferred out of that into something else. And what does that mean for me? What does that make of me? How does my overall story change? How does my overall identity change? And ideally, one ultimately moves into a stage known as integration, in which the whole story, including your new identity in whatever position you find yourself, all becomes, of a piece. Now, I do want to throw out one thought here, which is research-based. Again, it's sort of my opinion, but there is research to back this up. We're often, in using the Hopson and Adams model, thinking about situations in which people have lost their jobs, often involuntarily. And the research evidence here suggests that this is a deeply wounding event. When a person, especially someone who's held a position for years, possibly decades, loses that position, which has become integrated into their identity, and a good deal of their pride, their self-esteem, if you prefer, flows from their success in fulfilling this social role. It's deeply and enduringly wounding. And the person is likely not to fully recover from that for years to come, if indeed ever, even though they may have found their way into a new position that is every bit as good as the old one. Still, the wound is there. One of the 19th century British novelists, Anthony Trollope, once proposed a metaphor for this of, a man, it was all men back then, who has undergone a major blow in life that has really damaged him, being like a tree that in a storm has had the top, the trunk and the crown of the tree blown off. It may well recover. It may send out new branches and become a moderately healthy and successful looking tree, but it won't be the tree it was. And to some extent, I think Hopson and Adams are overly optimistic here about how positive the outcome will be when the crisis in question is an involuntary and undesirable one. They do distinguish between voluntary and involuntary, by the way. With the former being obviously much more controllable and less, profound in its impact on us. Now, what I'd like to do, I'm not primarily a career counselor, and what I'd like to do is to draw a parallel with the broader world of clinical mental health counseling and psychotherapy, and point out to you that what Hopson and Adams were saying is very, very similar to what Marty Horowitz's team was saying at about the same time. Horowitz, for those who aren't familiar with his work, developed a general theory of the stress response and of a kind of general stress response syndrome in the 1970s primarily, which essentially became the nucleus of what was in 1980 the newly minted diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And some of you may have seen, some viewers may have seen this model before, and if you haven't, it's worth a brief walkthrough. The idea is that you have a highly stressful event which occurs, and traumatic, for example, and this produces the immediate outcry. Notice the similarity here to the first stage after immobilization. There's the despair stage in Hopson and Adams, in which one is frightened and sad and or rageful, followed by a phase of denial in which one puts the lid on it and acts as if and thinks, at least consciously, as if no big deal has happened. Again, notice the parallel with minimization, which is likely to be followed by this intrusion phase when the all unbidden the thoughts and images come into the mind, potentially threatening to flood us. That's the more pathological outcome. And of course, that would parallel the self-doubt stage, wouldn't it? Now, one important feature in the Horowitz model that you don't see in Hopson and Adams is the notion that there can be a lot of back and forth, a lot of fluctuation between these stages. So there can be periods in which you're keeping the lid on it, holding everything in check, interspersed with periods in which it's all breaking through, and then back into I've got the lid on, then back into I'm being potentially flooded again. From there, we would move into the so-called working through phase, which would correspond to Hopson and Adams letting go, testing out, probably also the search for meaning. and eventually completion, getting on with one's life. And I think it's very important to be aware of this sort of parallel. The events that occur in our careers, barring, say, military careers, for the obvious example, in times of war, the events occurring in our careers rarely rise to the level of out-and-out trauma, but they can be very highly stressful. And the overall pattern or syndrome is pretty much the same whether we're talking about a more obviously social emotional event in our relationship life, or whether we're talking about an event in our working life, in our careers. By the way, I'm not saying that this Horowitz model is 100% the truth. This, remember, was the beginning, the nucleus of what became PTSD. The PTSD model has undergone some transformation since then, although honestly, pretty much all the symptoms in the DSM-5, the official manual as I speak, are directly derived from this. Okay, so that was the more general piece of what we're going to be doing today. From here, we'll be moving into some of the very specific sorts of problems that are, again, common in the work of career counselors, or frankly, counselors and psychotherapists in general. Yes, here's a transition. I intersperse with comics whenever possible, from graduate student identity to where do I go next identity. And the career counselor in this case using the Myers-Briggs, not my personal favorite, but popular among career counselors. Okay, so problem number one, a pretty obvious one. You lost your job unexpectedly, or at least against your own free will, so to speak. There's a few things I need to say here. And one is something that some viewers undoubtedly already know. When you look at the so-called unemployment statistics, online or in a newspaper, government press release, what have you, though the unemployment statistic or rate is really not meant as an index of human suffering, it's meant as an index of economic slack or tautness. So you are only considered to be unemployed if you are not working and looking for work. So if you have never worked, you're not unemployed. If you haven't managed to get your first real job, if you have given up looking for work, you're not unemployed, even though you've been out of work for a year or 2 years, you're a discouraged worker. There are other statistics that better capture how the workforce in general is doing, such as workforce participation. But the unemployment one is the one you see, every month. Here it is at 4.1% or 6.7% or what have you. It's also important to be aware, again, this is all more economics than psychology or sociology, that not all unemployment is considered to be equal. And this is relevant to us as counselors, even though it's not from our research base as such. So, one form of unemployment is known as frictional unemployment. And all that refers to is, being between jobs. It's not always the case that you leave job A on Friday at 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon after having, cake and tea or whatever, and walk into job B on Monday morning at 8:30, being greeted with open arms. Frequently, people either have lost a job and gone to look for a new one, or left a job in order to search for a new one. So it's kind of necessary. If you think about it, if nobody was unemployed, it would be virtually impossible to hire anybody. I suppose, except by hiring them away, and then you start running into the desperate inflationary cycle. You need to have at least some people out there milling around between jobs. In some occupations, this is very normative, by the way. So think about, say, construction work. You finish a construction project, and everybody gets laid off, and then you go looking for the next construction project. And some folks might decide to take a few weeks before they get serious about it. I need a break. Others are hitting the pavement right away, looking for the next, big high rise going up. So that's a pretty benign form, and people in occupations where it happens a lot kind of take it in stride. The second form is more problematic. That's cyclical unemployment. And that refers to the cycles in the economy. There are booms and busts in the life of any country's economy. And so at times the unemployment rate is relatively low because it's almost all frictional. But if the unemployment rate starts shooting up, the implication is that there's a cycle happening here. That's a bit worse because what it means is that a lot of people are losing their jobs all at once, and not everybody is going to find the next new great thing right away. So it's more anxiety provoking and disturbing for people. We don't know how long the down cycle is going to last. And so if I've been out of work now for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and perhaps my benefits from the government are running out and I haven't found anything, one becomes increasingly, understandably desperate. The third form, though, is the most toxic. This is known as structural unemployment. And this is when essentially entire categories of work are shrinking or vanishing altogether. In my lifetime in the United States, we have, for example, seen the tremendous structural changes in manufacturing. Many products are still manufactured in America, but the factories are much more automated than they were. So you don't need, 200 guys with rivet guns and whatnot lined up along an assembly line, each doing their little job. You might only need 5 guys, 5 men and women operating the computers that operate the robots producing the product. And other products, of course, are more inexpensively produced overseas. So, in the garment industry, all the garment factories are pretty much gone in this country, because if you pay a living wage in America, it pushes the costs up above what it would cost to make it somewhere else, say Bangladesh nowadays, and ship it to America. We've also seen this sort of thing happen in middle management with the advent of information technology, computers, and so forth. So really one person operating a database program and a spreadsheet program can do the work that several layers of management used to be required for. So you see this in multiple areas, among graphic artists and drafters. The advent of computer-assisted design and drafting was a huge issue, and so forth and so on. This is the most toxic because it means that not only did I lose my job, not only are other people losing theirs, but probably just about none of us are ever going to do that work again. It's gone. The entire identity is vanishing. I think as I speak in America today, a great deal of attention is being paid to this around coal mining, for example. There's a lot of talk about restoring mining jobs, but the fact is coal mining jobs have dwindled drastically over the last several decades, and it's not coming back. And how does one cope with this? Okay, enough on that. Now, unemployment per se is, of course, automatically stressful, but you don't really see major emotional or behavioral problems except when opportunities are relatively scarce, because then you've got too many people chasing too few jobs and everybody's anxious, and the ones who aren't getting the jobs are increasingly so. By the way, you can simulate this in laboratory with a rat colony. Just give them not quite enough food to go around and watch the rats get stressed out. Kind of sad experiment to do, but it has been done. And in human communities, what you see is more physical illness, more cases of heart disease and hypertension and heart attacks and other diseases, higher rates of alcohol and drug abuse, higher rates of domestic violence, and so forth and so on. All right. That was grim. Here's another one, which, since I fall into this category, is grim for me, but if you're a young viewer, you can sort of view it as not affecting you, at least not yet. And that is the problem faced by older workers. Traditionally, and this irks me since I'm well past that threshold, 45 is considered to be the threshold for being an older worker. Obviously, it varies a lot depending on what you do for a living. 45-year-old ballet dancer is done. A 45-year-old construction worker is getting past their prime, a 45-year-old lawyer is probably at the top of their game. So a lot depends on what you're doing. It is illegal to discriminate in employment settings on the basis of age, just as it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender or race. Discrimination is always difficult to prove, age discrimination especially so. It's virtually impossible to apply for a job without your age being pretty evident based on the fact that you have to submit records of your previous employment and your education. Anyone who's a college graduate, at minimum, they're 21, 22 years older than the date of their college degree, at minimum. There it is. If your employment history goes back to 1990, you've been working for 32 years as I record this, so you're probably at least 50, or 54 if you're a college grad. It's there you are. Now, discrimination is also very common because there are a lot of negative stereotypes about older workers. Not everything is untrue. It is certainly true that between, say, age 40 and 60, one's capacity for physical labor diminishes. That is a fact. It's not, however, the case that older workers are problematic in most respects. In fact, we tend to be more reliable, show up more regularly, to have more institutional loyalty, more of an identification with the organization, be more, in a sense, team players for the firm, rather than the more individualistic attitudes that it would be typical of someone who's just starting out and in their 20s. Older workers, fortunately, are less likely to become unemployed, to lose their jobs, but if they do, they're much more likely to stay there for a long time. So, whereas the 28-year-old who lost their position, say it's a managerial position, is relatively likely to find a new one within 3 to 9 months, the older worker, it may well take a year or a year and a half or more. And in some cases, they will never find a position commensurate with the one they had before. And so that's one of the big things. If you're a counselor working with a more mature worker who has lost their job or otherwise, been faced a major check in their career, they're going to have to come to terms with that. They're not going to be hired from a position of I'm not working into a better job than they had before. At least 9 times out of 10, that's not going to happen. They're, in fact, much more likely to be hired at a lower level. So they need to accept that, the peak of my career was perhaps then, but I'm still engaged in work because either I want to or I have to or both, though it may have to be at a lower level. I think, the big achievements are likely to be in the past here. Do I have to accept that I'm going to have much less status and lower pay than I used to? Yeah, I may have to accept that. I may even have to accept that I'm now basically retired, or somewhere in between. I was a bank vice president, but now if I want to bring in a bit of money, I'm just going to have to get some little job somewhere and bring in a little extra money, but I'm not going to be a bank officer anymore. This is very difficult for people to grapple with. And again, career counselors can't just be about, here's the facts, here's what you have open for you. You have to also be good counselors about the emotional issues involved. The comic here does mention the word burnout, by the way, and we will get to that one in a little bit. But it's quite difficult to cope with this sort of change. All right. Third change, and this one's more benign, thank you, than the last couple, most of the time, has to do with what's known as a mid-career shift. So what this refers to is if I've already become established in terms of Super's developmental theory, I'm stabilized into a particular occupation. I've presumably been in it for a matter of 5 or 10 or more likely even longer years, even more years, 15 or 20 years, and I'm going to switch out of that, or I'm thinking of switching out of that. So we're not just talking about changing jobs. If I'm a social worker with the state and I become a social worker with a private hospital or geriatric facility, I didn't change occupations, I just changed jobs, right? If I'm a social studies teacher in one community and I go and teach social studies in another, I'm still a high school teacher. If I'm a carpenter, who's been doing repair work and I go to work as a carpenter for a house construction company, again, same occupation. Nor do we use this term for the kinds of early changes that many, many people make as they're kind of searching for the right occupation, the kind of experimentation that happens during, what Super called the trial phases of a career. Now, why would I switch out of a career that I've been in for, say, 15 or 20 years or perhaps more? There are several possible reasons. One of them comes back to the old saw of the 40-year-old man trapped in the career chosen by the ignorant 18-year-old. Maybe it was a bad choice to begin with. I went into accounting because it was going to get me a good job, and I got a good job, and I've done pretty well for myself. But I really don't like accounting very much. Well, that's a problem, right? But again, if you're getting the extrinsic rewards of good pay and success, you may chug along for quite a while. I went into teaching because I wanted to make a difference, but I feel now that I'm not making much of a difference, and I'm also not being paid terribly well. So why am I doing this? Right. Another possibility, of course, is that one's the occupation was a good pick when you were 21, but now that you're 40, you've changed a bit and your interests are different or your values are different. I wanted to make money and get ahead and have a good lifestyle available for myself and my future family, but I really don't like what I'm doing because it's not helping society or humanity in any way. It seems more like a predatory sort of work. I want to do something that's good for the community, or you can imagine all the sorts of scenarios here. And then a third very distinct possibility, especially with the fast pace of social change nowadays, is that the occupation itself might not be what it used to be. You became a doctor thinking about the country doctor, with his or her surgery off in a wing of the house, and the old Victorian house, and people come walking up and like, doctor, I'm sick, and you take care of them. And now you find yourself part of some group practice in a faceless office suite or professional building, just spending half of your time arguing with insurance companies and the rest of it ordering blood work rather than doing careful personal diagnosis. And it's like, this isn't what I signed on for. All those graphic designers who loved drawing and paste ups and mechanicals and tape and glue and scissors, and now it's all keyboards and mice. It's not the same occupation anymore. For any one of these reasons, we might decide, I'm done with this, I think. I want out. Now, this is a very common presentation to career counseling services, private agencies serving adults, as well as state-sponsored agencies that still exist. But you should know that relatively few of the people thinking along these lines are actually going to do it. There are major obstacles in the way. You've got a lot of what you might call sunk costs in the career path you've been in, the occupation you've been working in, not least that you've invested all those years in both developing expertise and kind of working your way up some kind of hierarchy, some kind of ladder. And if you, in Super's term, recycle, you're going back to a much earlier stage of your career development. And so you're going to have lower status, probably lower pay. Your boss will be much younger than you in all likelihood. And that's all very difficult. People construct their lifestyles around the incomes they have and construct a lot of our sense of who we are around the status that we've earned. Now, there is, however, a very important special case here, a group of people who will frequently, I would even say normatively, make mid-career shifts, usually in their 40s. This is people in a very narrow slice of occupations that allow you to retire with full benefits, regardless of your age, as long as you've served for, say, 20 years. And I use the word served. The big examples are, in fact, the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, police force, and firefighters. And that's one of the attractions, of course, of signing up for the military, is that, wow, in 20 years I can retire. So here I am, 20. That means at 40 or 41, I can retire on half pay. Side note, only about, not quite sure, I think it's about 1 in 7 recruits ever actually gets to retire that way. They don't stay that long, but it's a nice little carrot to wave in front of you. And it does help to keep people in who've been in for like 10, 15 years. And they're saying, well, just 6 more years, if I sign up for one more 5-year tour of duty, I can retire. But it's a big deal. And they are likely to present with concerns to career counselors because on the one hand, they've got it made, right? They've got a guaranteed floor level of income, plus in case of military, VA benefits, which cover a good deal of potential medical costs. So they're in a position where they could pursue the dream job, and not worry about the fact that it only pays half as much, because half and half is whole. On the other hand, they've been in relatively sheltered environments in some ways. It's weird to say police or military sheltered when they're potentially being shot at, but I hope you know what I mean. Sheltered in that everything's very structured, and especially in the military, all major decisions are being made for you, or a lot of them are, and that's where your next meal is being served if you're living on base or on a ship, for example. And now you're coming out into the civilian world, or for police and firefighters, the non-civil service world, and it's a kind of a wild west out there. What do people do, and how do they navigate that? So they're likely to need some help. The military does provide a sort of outplacement counseling for people preparing to be discharged, though an awful lot of the military personnel leaving don't really take full advantage of it. And then they find themselves floundering a bit afterwards. Sometimes going back to the VA for help with that, and sometimes seeing you as a private person. Okay. Because, again, there can be all sorts of reasons for changing a career, and I suppose all sorts of reasons for not changing one's occupation. I mean, who wouldn't want to be the Pigeon King? All right. Fourth case, which is really a special case of Case 3, is that of women who have been out of the workforce for a period of time owing to childbearing, child rearing, and are now returning to the paid workforce. This is what Super referred to as the interrupted career pattern. Way back in the 60s, when he collected his original data, this was, not rare, but not terribly common. But now, of course, it's pretty much the norm, except for women who don't leave the workforce at all. The idea, again, is that you've put in some years. We're not talking just 6 months, but maybe 5 or 10 or even 20 years in a full-time homemaker role, working hard at a complicated job for which you're not getting paid in cash, and now you're ready to not be in that role full-time anymore, but come back into the so-called paid workforce. And this can occur at any point. For some women, it's, the youngest child is now in full-time school, kindergarten or first grade is full day. Now I'm free for it. Others have at the other extreme, it might be not until they've finished high school. And it's like, well, I don't need to do that anymore. And anywhere in between, there can be like a subjective sense, that the child is now old enough that they don't need me to be here all the time, and it's time for me to get back out there. Now, this can happen because the woman simply wants to get back into the big world. I'm tired of the world of nothing but, play dates and little kids and shuttling them to and fro and shopping and cooking and cleaning everything and being a medic, et cetera, et cetera. I want to actually be with adults doing adult stuff. It also can be as simple as a need for money. Very difficult nowadays, as all of you probably know, for a single wage earner to support a family of 3, 4, 5, 6 people. And also there's a reasonable chance that a partner will either leave or that you'll leave the partner before you get old and gray and go to the grave together. So you need money. And of course, it can be any combination of these things. Now, for a woman in this situation, the big decision they're making is whether to do something that they can get now or whether to seek additional training, additional education, so that they'll qualify for something new. If they're going to go for something they're ready for now, they need, of course, to check on whether if their skill set is up to date. So if I used to work as a nurse or I used to work as a teacher or what have you, what do I need to do to rev up, bring myself up to speed on the new developments in my field? If I can't do that, then I need to think about serious retraining. But also I may decide that I want to do significant additional training or education. By the way, I use teacher and nurse, very stereotypical female occupations. I should apologize for that, but there's a reason I thought of those. When women in this situation do choose to retrain, they usually do opt for more traditional feminine type occupations. So they're, if they go back to, say, a graduate school, it's likely to be to become a teacher or a social worker or a nurse or something. That's not to say there's any rule that has to be the case. It just statistically seems to work out that way much of the time. Very much on the plus side, although this could be a very difficult transitional period, women doing this generally succeed in making the transition and are happy with their new identities as workers, which, again, all of this is to the good. But a very difficult decision. Do I go to work now? Do I pursue additional training? Very difficult indeed. And, there's a great deal too that a counselor can provide as both as a sounding board and sometimes as a guide. The woman has grown accustomed to a certain type of interaction, a certain kind of society. And what's going to happen out there in the paid workforce can be quite different. Now, a lot here depends on how much background she had. If she had worked in the paid workforce for, say, 10 years before assuming a homemaker role, and now it's, say, 10 years later, she remembers what she's getting into. If she had settled into the homemaker role within 2 or 3 years of finishing school, and it's been 20 years, she may not be fully aware of all the stuff that she's going to have to deal with out there. And she'll want some guidance through that. Okay, yes, here's career guidance actually it looks probably she's supposed to be a governess or nanny, but career guidance as the mommy with child. All right. Yes, one more, burnout. Now, this is a really kind of a poorly used term, or a term that's used much more widely than it should be. It's often when people say, yeah, I'm burned out on this, what they mostly mean is, I don't like my job. I'll spend a few minutes on job dissatisfaction a little later, but let's look at the more narrow construct of burnout, what the term was invented for. And burnout was actually supposed to be a kind of syndrome, like a pattern of response. It was first described by Freudenberger back in the early to mid 1970s among people who were working very idealistically at places like free clinics, community-based aid clinics that provided free or low-cost treatment, so-called therapeutic communities, and so forth. Now, what you had here, again, were very idealistic young people. We're coming down off the late 60s, and so the dream was, we're going to change the world. We're going to make this a better world. We're going to go in, with our medical degrees and our nursing degrees and our psychology and our social work degrees and our teaching credentials, and we're going to go into the poorest communities and the inner cities and the poor rural areas, and we're just going to transform everything. And so you go in and you're healing and you're teaching and you're guiding people through crises. And then after a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, on the greater scheme of things, nothing seems to have changed, right? You still have people coming in with the same problems, not infrequently the same people. And it feels like you're just on this dreadful treadmill, trying to make a difference. By the way, you are making a difference, but it doesn't feel like it because you're not able to change the totality of society enough to make a noticeable impact. So what happens? These people who had been highly motivated, like, we're going to do it. I don't care if we're not making any money. I'll sleep on a bare mattress on the floor. They get less motivated, less happy about it all. They get literally physically tired, and they get mentally tired. Now, if you've looked into burnout at all, you've probably heard of this thing called the Maslach Burnout Inventory. It's a self-report inventory, not too long, several versions of it. They're all about the same, which has 3 subscales. One of them is called emotional exhaustion. And this is also referred to as compassion fatigue. And it's basically where you start to just not care anymore. The second scale is referred to as cynicism, or in some versions as depersonalization. That's a terrible name for it because there is a dissociative symptom in psychiatry called depersonalization, and any clinician knows that term. It's not what we're referring to. It's more dehumanizing your clientele. So, cynical, dehumanizing attitudes towards the patients, the students, the clients that you've been working so hard to help. And lastly, there's a dimension of a feeling of accomplishment or self-efficacy, which gets low. So that's if that's high, that's good, but if it's low, that's part of the so-called burnout syndrome. So what you're looking for is really all 3 of these things being present: the cynical attitudes, the drained emotional quality, and the sense of not really being effective or powerful or able to get anything done. There's been a lot of research on burnout. Not all of it's very good, but there's been a lot of it. So we can point out some pretty obvious risk factors. Your workload's too much. It's unmanageable. You fundamentally can't keep up, where you're staying for hours after hours, multiple times a week just to keep up with it. You've got clients or students who are just difficult. They don't seem to get a lot better. The students don't seem to learn very much. The patients aren't healing very well, whatever. You don't have much control over your work. Not a lot of autonomy, not a lot of, personal control. And so you're being perhaps micromanaged, or you have policies that constrain your decision-making very tightly. If the peer relations are toxic, or especially if the supervision is either toxic or very inconsistent, and basically you feel unsupported. It's like, I'm just going in there, doing it, and nobody's got my back, nobody cares, nobody's helping me manage this stuff. And you're not being recognized. It feels as though you're either being evaluated unfairly. Look, I managed to help, went out of my way and I managed to help these people accomplish this. Oh yes, but your overall numbers are down. Look, I got that really desperate family housed, and they've got entitlements enough, and the parents are actually looking for work now. Yes, but look at all these things you didn't do. So you're just not being recognized for your work. And also, when you run into conflicts between what you believe should be done and what's being demanded in the workplace. I remember, this shows my age, but I remember back in the, I guess 1980s, probably during the Reagan years, the role of social workers working for state agencies that provide benefits like unemployment benefits and food stamps and the like, at housing programs, was changed. So what they had all been trained to do, and as good social workers, this is what they wanted to do, was to help people identify programs and benefits they were entitled to, right, and apply for those and access those resources. But the positions were being redefined as, how do you get people to stop using the resources? So the workplace demand, what you're being evaluated based on, is how many people did you get off the unemployment rolls? How many people did you get out of the housing program, whereas what you really want to do is get people, into homes with enough money to buy food. That sort of conflict is very difficult to deal with. By the way, anyone who's watching this who's worked in either education or human services is probably going, oh yeah, that looks like everybody I know is in that situation. And yes, it's generally accepted that people doing various types of human services work, in some counseling and social work settings, for example, some healthcare settings, as well as folks in many education settings are at high risk here. There are some closely related constructs that you don't hear about as much. Rust out is one. And what that is bounced to is, here you are, a super highly trained person, and your job is way simple. So you have your degree in mental health counseling from a fine university, and your job is, essentially doing academic advisement and nothing but. It's you're a guidance counselor whose only real functions are to make sure students are getting the credits they need to graduate and contacting the ones who are in trouble. And it's like, well, what happened to all the wonderful stuff I learned about counseling and psychotherapy and assessment, and even career counseling? I'm not getting to do it. I'm bored. Another one, of course, is plateauing. We've all heard of that. It's where you've reached a certain level, and that's where you're going. You're not likely to get any more promotions, so nothing's going to change from here on. So maybe you're 40 years old and you're saying, well, I expect to work another 25, 30 years. And wow, it's all going to be the same as the last 5, huh? Wow. Right. Side note again, as I keep saying, I'm really more clinical in background and less career counseling as such. It's worth thinking about parallels with what used to be called, and still sometimes is called, neurasthenia, and the closely related diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, so-called. Neurasthenia, for those who haven't heard of it, literally translates as nervous weakness or nerve trouble, nerve weakness. It's a psychiatric syndrome, which was first described in the 19th century, notably by the American psychiatrist or alienist Beard. And the core of neurasthenia, the definition changes a bit over the course of 150 years, naturally, but it involves difficulty concentrating, like a real trouble, like mental effort just can't be made to happen. Fatigue, mental and physical fatigue after only modest effort has been exerted. Sleep that is unrefreshing. You wake from sleep and you don't feel, ready to go, wake up again. Headaches are frequently a part of it, often very debilitating headaches, and often some combination of anxiety or depression, or both. It's not in the DSM. It was in the International Classification of Diseases through the 10th edition. In the 11th edition, to make the diagnosis, it's in kind of an other category, like other anxiety disorder or what have you, though there are parallel diagnoses in East Asian cultures, in both China and Japan, notably. They're not uncommon syndromes. Where you tend to see neurasthenia, if it's a real thing, is in people who've tried. See, this is why it's career related. They've really worked to get ahead. They've done everything in their power and they haven't quite made it. And they've tried again and they haven't quite made it. And they've tried again and they haven't quite made it. And it's as if you've drained, to be very literal about it, it's like you've drained all the reserve catecholamines, like all the dopamine and norepinephrine and such are just like depleted, and you don't have anything in reserve in the tank. So as soon as you get up and try to do it, you use up what little you were able to secrete, synthesize yesterday, and you're back flattened out again. Right. It's a diagnosis, by the way, if you're into, 19th and early 20th century literature, you see it a lot. Neurasthenic personalities were sort of a stock character in novels and short stories for quite a long time. And it has obvious parallels with the more recently introduced diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. In fact, if you look at the ICD-10 criteria for neurasthenia and the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome, they're basically identical. The difference is that chronic fatigue syndrome is thought usually to have an as yet unknown physical cause. People talk about things like Guillain-Barré, whatever, but there's the Epstein-Barr rather virus, but there's no direct evidence linking any specific physical cause to CFS, but it is suspected that a majority of cases do have a physical cause, though it's also pretty widely suspected that a large minority of cases are parallel to neurasthenia. So worth keeping in mind when you're looking at burnout, it may not just be that they don't like what they're doing. There may really be a syndrome here that's impairing their ability to function and that needs to be taken seriously. Life changes need to be made. I said I'd say a little about job satisfaction, job dissatisfaction, then we'll wrap up completely. So here, I just want to present you with a little bit from the work of Herzberg. This is really out of organizational psychology, IO psychology, and study of work motivation. Herzberg famously suggested that there are actually two distinct constructs involved here. There's job satisfaction and there's job dissatisfaction. And they're not just opposite ends of the same thing, they're kind of at right angles to each other. So if you're trying to motivate employees, there are two sets of factors that can make a difference. The first set he refers to as hygiene factors. And they don't make you happy with your job, but they make you less unhappy. They can prevent you from being miserable about it. That's a big difference. There's, oh boy, this is going to be fun today. And there's, okay, this is worth doing because I'll get ... Very different experiences. So hygiene factors are mostly things that can be provided externally. They're extrinsic motivators, to use the jargon of psychology. And that includes most of what people think of as motivating, although he doesn't consider them to be motivators. He calls them hygiene. They're keeping it from being bad. More, higher salary, bonuses, performance bonuses, year-end bonuses, your medical insurance or a life insurance policy or whatever, you're getting some kind of pension. Not most of us aren't, but you might be. Here's your nice, comfortable office. Here's the great equipment that we're providing you with. Here's the good supervision that you're receiving. Here's your job security, your contract for the next 5 years. All those sorts of things. See, not one of those is going to make you love your work, but they will, if present in sufficient degree, make you quite willing to show up and do the work, even though you feel pretty neutral about it. But again, not going to make you want to do it. And of course, the real secret sauce for the best managers and entrepreneurs and all is, how do I get people to really want to work, to really dive into it, body and soul, as opposed to just being willing to keep doing it and not leave. All right, so those are what Herzberg calls motivators. Now, again, these aren't really easy to manipulate because they mostly come from within. So unless we can effect, personality change or attract the right kind of people, we can't always change them that much. But maybe we can make the work interesting. So job enrichment programs, can we give the employees more control, more autonomy to make decisions without fear of repercussions, so they can, think things through and solve problems? Then they'll have more of a sense of achievement. When they do achieve something, can we recognize them for it? So that it's publicly acknowledged by all that this was a good thing they succeeded in doing. And again, here you have extrinsic motivators, but they're often small sort of token things. You get the special parking lot for the month, something like that. Just in general, feeling like you're powerful, responsible, in charge of things is intrinsically motivating. And again, much harder to give people this stuff. In some ways, you have to create the sort of job that will attract people who are motivated this way, but people actually will work harder, will work better under these conditions. And again, job dissatisfaction is not the same thing as burnout, although anyone who's burned out on their job is clearly dissatisfied. An awful lot of people who don't like their jobs much are not really burned out. All right, so to conclude, Career transitions, of course, are stressful events, and they are in many ways like other stressful events, other life-changing events, in the terms of the pattern of responses, the sequence of responses that are likely to follow. That's especially true when it's an unexpected and unwanted change. We've covered some of the most common problems that counselors, especially career counselors, will encounter in their clientele: involuntary job loss, discrimination against older workers, mid-career shifts, women returning to the workforce after a period, the paid workforce after a period away, and burnout and its many cousins. And please do remember that burnout, again, is a relatively ill-defined term as most people use it. And in many cases, it can range from anywhere from simple dissatisfaction with one's job all the way up to really a psychiatric kind of syndrome, formerly known as neurasthenia. And that concludes our work for today. So I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to have to trim this a little bit.